Okay, so I often get asked, can I substitute baking powder for baking soda? So the simple answer is no, you unfortunately can't just substitute, 1 teaspoon of baking powder with 1 teaspoon of baking soda. And taking a few minutes to understand the differences between the two will, 1, make you a better baker, and 2, help you determine when you can or can't use either of them. So both baking powder and baking soda are leavening agents which are commonly used in baking. They help baked goods rise, which gives them that light and fluffy texture that you want. However, they do have a few distinct characteristics and applications that are important to note. So let's start with the chemical properties of each substance. Baking soda is a pure chemical compound known as sodium bicarbonate, and it's what we call a base, and so it requires an acid to activate, its leavening properties that we want. So when baking soda reacts with an acid, it produces carbon dioxide gas, which is what causes our batter or dough to rise. Baking powder, on the other hand, is a combination of an acid, usually cream of tartar, and an alkaline substance, usually baking soda, as well as a starch to prevent the baking powder from prematurely activating. Now what happens is when you mix baking powder with a liquid, then it releases carbon dioxide gas, which gives us that rise that we want. Now there is also double-acting baking powder, which is the type that you find at most grocery stores and is also the type that most home cooks use. And double-acting baking powder releases gas in 2 stages. So once during mixing, when it starts to kind of bubble up a little, you probably can't even really notice it, and then again during baking, where the heat from the oven activates the baking powder, and this heat is what activates most of that leavening power. So how does the chemical properties of each of these substances affect how they work in baking? Now when it comes to using baking soda, you have to make sure that there's an acid in your batter. Something like, yogurt, buttermilk, lemon juice, or even vinegar. Without an acid in your batter, the baking soda won't be activated and you're going to end up with a dense, cake or cupcake. And it's also going to leave a metallic or almost soapy taste in your baking. Now you also need to make sure that you're using the right amount of, acid to baking soda in your baked goods, because again, if you use too much baking soda and not enough acid, you're going to end up with, a soapy or metallic taste in your baking. Now baking powder, on the other hand, has its own acid already mixed in, and so liquid on its own, as well as, the heat when you come to baking your batter, will be enough to activate the baking powder. Now what about the taste and texture? Now when it comes to baking soda, when it's used appropriately, then it does leave a slight distinctive taste as well as darker color to your baked goods. It's very common to use it in things like chocolate or banana cake, but you do have to be careful though, because as mentioned earlier, if you use too much of it, it will leave, a slightly metallic or soapy taste behind. Now baking powder, on the other hand, it has more of a neutral taste and it won't affect, the flavor of your baked goods, as long as, you don't go overboard, because if you do use too much baking powder, then it can leave almost like a slightly bitter taste in your baked goods. Baking powder also won't affect the color of your baked goods, and so it's a great option to use in things which, you want a really light color, like a white cake. Now the last thing that I just wanted to touch on was the difference in leavening power. So it's important to note that baking soda is much stronger than baking powder, almost 3 to 4 times as strong. So for 1 teaspoon of baking soda, the equivalent would be about 3 teaspoons of baking powder. Now in general, I don't recommend substituting one for the other, but if you are in a pickle and you just really need to use either of them, then firstly, if you're using baking soda, then you just want to make sure that you have an acid in your batter. You can also add an acid in, if you need to, for example, a teaspoon of vinegar, or if you want to use baking powder, then just make sure that you use more of it. So, if your recipe uses about half a teaspoon of baking soda, then you want to use about 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder. So I hope all that information helped you better understand the difference between baking powder and baking soda. And trust me when I say, these little bits of information have personally helped me become a way better baker than I was before, and I really hope that it helps you on your baking journey as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.